Dr. Hassett, if you were king for a day and you could change our tax code, what would you put in its place?
I mentioned this in my testimony, Senator, and after checking ethics rules, found that I was able to promise to send you all a book that AEI is about to publish by our top tax economist, Alan Viard. He's written it with another tax economist, Bob Carroll, and it lays out a progressive consumption tax called an X tax in the kind of gory detail that people who are going to write tax law actually need to see. Mr. Viard, as many people know, writes a regular column in Tax Notes, is very schooled in tax law, and has sort of looked at where all the dead bodies are buried if you're trying to make something like this law. And so I think that the most ready for prime time conservative tax reform out there is a progressive consumption tax called the X tax, and that our book is coming out in a few weeks is going to show everybody exactly how they can make it happen.
You referred to that in your written testimony, I believe, as part of the kind of a variation of the VAT.
It is all consumption taxes you could sort of think of as a variation of the VAT. The Hall-Rabushka flat taxes as well. In fact, if you've ever seen Bob Hall give a presentation about it, one reason he calls it the flat tax that they decided on that design is that they think that a value-added tax, as it's structured in Europe, would be very unpopular in the U.S. And so he kind of moves the places where collection happens around a little bit to make it conform more to the U.S. system. And so it looks a lot more like what we do, but the economic effect of it would be very similar to that if we had a sales tax or VAT. The Viard enterprise is exactly the same thing. So it looks a lot like what we do, but by moving things around and exempting capital from taxation and so on, you end up with something that looks very much like a value-added tax, which is a good thing when you're running tax reform models, because the value-added tax is the type of tax that gives you the biggest economic growth effect and welfare effect in the long run.
So this type of model would render obsolete this debate that we've had recently about what to do about capital gains, as far as, you know, at what rate you tax that, because it would be focused on consumption rather than income or capital gains.
That's correct. That's correct. And you know, I think that there's so much to commend an approach like that, both, you know, distributionally. Since it's a progressive consumption tax, then the folks who have that as their #1 issue, they can come to the table and help you set the rates. There are also interesting transitional distributional effects. If Warren Buffett were to go out and buy an airplane today, he wouldn't pay a consumption tax on it, but if all of a sudden you have a consumption tax, then he would. And so his old wealth is being taxed. There are just many, many reasons why I think that in some Congress soon, it's quite likely that there's going to be a big tax reform again, because, again, I gave you the scale of the challenge or the target of what we could get. You know, if we'd done it 10 years ago, where we would be today, how much better it would be. I think that if the economy continues to be weak, that something like the X tax should get broad bipartisan support.
Okay. And I assume you would say that, going back to my two-part analysis earlier of the purpose of the tax code having two purposes, to raise revenue and communicate adequately and accurately to the electorate the true cost of government, I assume your insistence would be that this would perform that second function much better.
It would be, yeah, much more transparent what was happening. That's correct.
Okay. Dr. Gravel, what would you do if made king, queen, czarina for the day, and you could do anything to our tax code?
I probably wouldn't do a lot different from what we have now. CRS just released a report where we looked specifically at base broadening and individual income tax reform. And tax reform and fundamental tax reform looks a lot easier when you talk about it in generalities than when you talk about it in specifics. So, for example, ideas such as eliminating tax expenditures by taxing Medicare, which would be a disaster for low-income people, by taxing capital gains at death, by taxing pensions. We have a list of the 20 top tax expenditures. You start looking at those and you see that they're very hard. Now, the thing that Kevin talked about, the progressive consumption tax, I mean, that would be a very radical change, and there would be some big windfall gains and losses, a very difficult transition to that tax. And I think once you start looking at those, you might want to rethink whether that's a good way to go. With respect to the corporate tax, I just think we need to be careful because corporate tax doesn't have as many tax expenditures. And if you do something about depreciation or things like that, you're actually going to increase the cost of capital on a revenue-neutral change. So also, I found that if you eliminated every tax expenditure, you could only reduce the corporate tax by about 5 percentage points. So I think you have to look very realistically at exactly what you have to do with tax reform before you decide which way to go.
So every loophole, every deduction, every credit, everything under the current system would allow you to reduce that only by 5%.
And the corporate tax, only about 5
tax,
percentage points, yeah, to maybe 30%, maybe a little less. That's long-run revenue neutral, not short run. Short run has some budget scams in it, so.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we conclude, let me ask, because we do, like